So today DJI announced their brand new Avata drone, and this thing is not only tiny, but it's also very capable. Alongside this drone, they're also releasing their brand new DJI Goggles tube, so there's a lot to be excited about. Now, before I dive into the specs of all this new gear, first let me show you a couple clips that I shot with this drone over the past month. Now, to those of you who are already in the FPV world, this drone is pretty much a Cinewoop, as it's a smaller drone and has prop guards, so you can fly it in smaller spaces and you don't have to worry as much about damaging your surroundings or potentially hurting anyone because the props aren't as exposed. Sorry bro, I don't know what you said, I just got swarmed by goats.
No. Oh my god.
So this is a completely different type of FPV drone and definitely isn't meant to replace the current DJI FPV drone. The Avata is a new addition to DJI's line of filmmaking tools and can excel in certain situations where the DJI FPV drone would probably not be the best option. And it's also a very good introductory FPV drone for anyone that's new to FPV, as it's a much safer way to start because of its smaller size, lower power output, and protective prop guards. So let's dive into the specs.
Dude, I thought you broke my screen.
This drone is small. This is what it looks like when I hold it in my hands, and it weighs only 410 grams. This is 50% lighter than the DJI FPV drone. The battery life can give you up to 18 minutes of flight time, which is really good for a Cinewoop, but it depends on how you're flying. When I was pushing this thing out on the dirt bike track to its absolute limit, I was only able to get about 7 or 8 minutes of flight time, which is still pretty good given the fact that I was going pretty much full throttle almost the entire time. The Avata has downward obstacle sensors, so it's able to intelligently know whether it's safe to land. However, it doesn't have any other sensors, so I wouldn't fully trust it to return to home on its own, especially if you're in an environment that has a lot of obstacles. So the camera can shoot up to 4K 60 frames per second and 2.7K 100 frames per second. But if you're using the DJI FPV Goggles V2, then you're able to push the frame rate up to 120 frames per second at 2.7K. Unfortunately, I didn't have those goggles on me while testing the drone, so the max frame rate I could get was 100 frames per second. On the left is footage shot at 4K 60 frames per second, and on the right is footage shot at 2.7K 100 frames per second. So the sensor is a 1/1.7 inch CMOS sensor. So this is actually bigger than the previous DJI FPV drone. And you know, I'm always down for bigger sensors. You can also film in either standard or D-Cine-alike picture profiles. I pretty much shoot everything in D-Cine-alike on DJI's drones just because it gives me more flexibility when color grading in post. So with this new drone, we also have a new type of stabilization. On top of its existing rock-steady electronic image stabilization, we also have horizon steady, which allows us to get even smoother footage from the drone. In this first clip, we're using rock steady, which is what we're used to from the original DJI FPV drone. Now in the second clip, this is what horizon steady looks like. You can see it looks a lot smoother and that horizon stays level throughout the entire shot. Now, another thing to note is that DJI is allowing us to get gyro data from the drone so that we can use third-party software like GyroFlow to stabilize our footage in post. This is a feature I personally really wanted to see in DJI's first FPV drone, so I'm really happy that they've decided to include this in the Avata. Now, the one thing I'd love to see a performance increase in with the sensor is the low light. I was able to shoot in a few darker locations and I had to bump my ISO to 400 and sometimes 800 to get a usable exposure. And you can definitely start to see the grain at 800 ISO, but you can always apply noise removal in post. The Avata also allows you to take photos, which is a first for an FPV drone. I'm not sure if this would be my first choice for aerial photography, but if this is the only drone you have on you, then it's great to have the ability to do so. So one really cool feature that DJI includes in their FPV line of drones is turtle mode. And no, this doesn't mean that you can get the drone to go really slow. Turtle mode allows you to quickly flip the drone if you've ever crashed and you're upside down. This is a very convenient option because in FPV, a lot of the time you will crash. And sometimes you might crash far away from where you're controlling the drone. Now, instead of having to run, hike, or even sometimes bushwhack to get back to your drone, you can first try turtle mode to see if you can get your drone to flip upright, and then you can take off from there. Now that brings me to the goggles, and there's a lot to love about these things. The first major noticeable change is of course its size and weight. These goggles are much smaller than the previous FPV goggles and no longer require you to screw in the antennas, which is a huge time saver. For someone that travels as much as me, I appreciate the reduction in size and weight as it makes packing a lot easier and takes a lot of weight off of my back. They also feel really good on the face, and the seal around the edges is nice and snug, so it doesn't let as much light into the goggles. Now, DJI has also made it even easier to fine-tune the optics within the goggles for your personal eyesight. We could change the spacing between the lenses with these knobs on the underside of the goggles, and if we turn them, we're able to adjust the focal point of each lens. This allows the user to fine-tune the focus for each eye, so that the image looks as clear as possible, no matter how near or far-sighted you are. Now, the way we navigate in the goggles is also different. The old physical buttons have now been replaced with a touch-sensitive pad on the right side of the goggles that allows you to swipe and tap to navigate through the menu. Personally, I like this a lot more than physical buttons. We can even quickly access certain quick menus by swiping from the top, left, or bottom of the touchpad. This makes accessing certain settings very quick and easy. So personally, I love everything that DJI has done with these new goggles. My only concern is the battery life. I would get pretty close to draining the battery after about 5 flights with the drone. So if I was buying this drone and plan on doing at least 5 flights in a day, I would definitely consider buying at least 2 of these batteries. Thankfully, they are pretty small, so carrying 2 of these on you is pretty chill. Now, the remote is the exact same as the previous DJI FPV remote. On the left, we have the mode switch, which allows us to switch between normal, sport, and manual mode. Now, manual mode is the mode that allows you to have complete control of the drone, but it needs to be enabled within the menu of the goggles, and you'll also need to loosen the left joystick so it's loose and doesn't stick. You'll also want to practice flying manual mode in DJI's simulator beforehand so you can get an understanding of what it feels like to fly before you try it in real life. We also have the brake button, which allows you to conveniently brake at any time. So if you're flying and you need to quickly stop and get stable, you can hit that brake button and the drone will stop in its place and hover. It's a very useful feature that I personally use both on the DJI FPV drone as well as the Avata. Now, we can also control the drone with DJI's motion controller. This controller essentially allows you to fly the drone by tilting and rotating your hand. When paired with the drone, you'll see a white circle in the middle of the screen that moves with the movement of your controller. This can be very intuitive and make the flight experience more immersive for beginners, because you basically just move the white circle in the screen to where you want it to go and you pull the trigger to speed up. So with this launch, DJI is really pushing the motion controller because it's a much simpler way for new people to get into the world of FPV. So it's a really cool way for someone with pretty much no experience to just pick up the remote and start flying. But one thing to note with the motion controller is you can't actually fly it in manual mode like you would with the normal remote. With the motion controller, you can only fly in normal or sport mode, so you don't have that full control that you would when flying in manual mode. So I've had a ton of fun testing out this drone over the past month, and I'm stoked to be adding it to my toolbox of filmmaking gear. Now, in my own workflow, this will probably be my drone of choice when shooting near people or in locations where I definitely don't want to damage the environment, like the time that I flew through this very expensive one-of-one concept car in the Museum of the Future in Dubai. I know I can definitely still fly a normal FPV drone through this gap, but it's definitely way less stressful with the Avata. So that's it for this review. Thank you, DJI, so much for letting me test out this drone. I'll see you guys in the next one.